And new this evening, 40 years after the murder of a Greenville teenager, investigators believe they have finally identified her killer. 70's Julia Keener has a story.
For 4 decades, Chelsie Moss's family lived without answers. Now, thanks to advances in DNA technology and years of work by the Greenville County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, investigators say they've made a major breakthrough, leading to an arrest in the long unsolved case.
40 years. That is how long Chelsie Yvonne Moss waited for justice. And the man who took it from her, he was never hiding. He was already in prison for another murder. On June 16, 2026, the Greenville County Sheriff's Office made an announcement that would end a 40-year silence. The Cold Case Unit had identified the killer of an 18-year-old girl, and the answer was worse than anyone expected. It is April 7, 1986. You are walking along the edge of a tree line where Fair Street meets Kearns Avenue in Greenville, South Carolina. This is the West End, not a place anyone comes looking for anything. The ground is still damp from spring rain. 20 feet ahead in the undergrowth, you notice something. At first, it does not register. Then it does, the body of a young woman. She has been beaten to death. She has been left here in the woods like she was nothing. Her name is Chelsie Yvonne Moss. She is 18 years old. And for the next 40 years, the man who did this will walk free, but not far. Chelsie Moss was 18 years old in 1986. She was known in the West End of Greenville. She spent time on Pendleton Street, a stretch of road lined with shops and small businesses, the kind of place where you recognize faces, where you look out for one another. Or at least, that is what people told themselves. Her family knew her as a young woman with a life still taking shape. Friends described her as someone you would notice, someone who made an impression. She was not invisible, but on April 7, 1986, someone treated her like she was. The Greenville County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. Investigators documented what they found. Blunt force trauma, foul play, homicide. Those words went into the file. And then, for reasons that are still difficult to understand, the case began to go cold. Detectives interviewed witnesses. They tracked Chelsie's last known movements through the West End, Pendleton Street, the streets she walked, the people she knew. They collected evidence. They preserved what they could. But the 1980s were not the era of forensic DNA. The tools that exist now, the databases, the genealogical matching, the ability to extract a profile from a sample invisible to the naked eye, none of that was available. What they had were leads. And one by one, those leads ran out. The case file grew thicker. Then it stopped growing. Then it was shelved. Months passed. Years passed. Decades. The detectives who originally worked Chelsea's case retired. Some of them died. The West End changed. Pendleton Street changed. Greenville became a different city, but the case file remained, sitting in a box, waiting. And there was something in that box that the original investigators did not know they had preserved. Something that 40 years later would finally speak. In February 2023, the Greenville County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit picked up Chelsie Moss's file. This was the 16th cold case homicide the unit had taken on. They had solved the first 15. They intended to solve this one too. The unit began the work of reconstructing a 40-year-old investigation. They re-interviewed anyone still alive who might remember something. They re-examined every piece of physical evidence that had been preserved. And they sent samples to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's DNA lab. Here is what very few people were talking about at the time. The technology that exists inside forensic DNA labs today is fundamentally different from what existed even 10 years ago. Scientists can now extract usable DNA profiles from samples so degraded, so small, so old that previous generations of technology would have produced nothing. The SLED lab went to work. The lab ran the tests. They compared the results against criminal databases, and they found a match. The DNA profile from the evidence preserved in 1986 matched a man whose genetic material was already in the system. A man who had been convicted of murder 3 years after Chelsie Moss died. His name was Ronnie Lee Williams. Williams was already incarcerated in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. He had been there since 1989, 37 years serving time for another killing. But that first murder, Chelsea's murder, he had gotten away with. Until now, Ronnie Lee Williams was convicted of murder in 1989. The victim was a woman named Imelda Farrell. She was killed in her own home on Maple Street in Greenville. The details of that case are difficult to hear. During Williams's trial, a 13-year-old girl took the witness stand. She testified under oath that she saw Ronnie Lee Williams holding a bloody knife to her mother's throat minutes before her mother was dead. A child witnessed her own mother's murder, and she told the court exactly what she saw. Williams was convicted. He was sent to prison, but he never admitted to anything else. He never mentioned Chelsie Moss. He never confessed to another killing. The system assumed it had dealt with him, but the system did not know what the cold case unit would eventually find. Williams was 32 years old when Chelsie was killed. He was walking the same streets, living in the same city, the West End. Pendleton Street, the places Chelsie was known to spend her time. The overlap was there, buried in 40 years of silence, and the DNA pulled it out of the dark. On June 16, 2026, the Greenville County Sheriff's Office announced that Ronnie Lee Williams, age 64, had been charged with murder in the death of Chelsie Yvonne Moss. Sheriff Lewis addressed the media. He did not use dramatic language. He did not need to. No matter how many years passed, he said, our investigators remained committed to serving justice for Ms. Moss.
Very limited as far as any type of forensic testing that they were able to do.
That changed in 2023 when the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reopened the case.
Fortunately, we were able to retain all of the evidence that was collected, and 3.5 years ago, when I began working the case, one of the first things that we did was submit all the evidence from the case to SLED.
Authorities say the evidence led them to 64-year-old Ronnie Lee Williams.
He does have a violent history. He is serving time. He's serving life in prison here in South Carolina for murder. Happened in 1988. He was convicted in 1989.
Williams has now been charged with murder in Moss's death and is awaiting a bond hearing. Meanwhile, investigators continued to gather information about both Chelsie Moss and Ronnie Lee Williams.
We still have a trial to go through. He still has the right to a trial. He wants to be able to make his case for it, even though he's in prison for life. We want to make sure that we have witnesses that can help make this case as strong as possible.
Today, their resolve directly contributed to another solved case and ultimately additional closure for her family. Williams was already in prison. He was not going anywhere. But now, the charge he had avoided for 40 years was on the record. Here is the question that sits at the center of this case. What if the DNA technology that exists today had existed in 1986? What if Williams had been identified after the first murder instead of after the second? Imelda Farrell would still be alive. That is not speculation. That is the timeline. Chelsie Moss was killed in 1986. Imelda Farrell was killed in 1989. 3 years. 3 years during which Ronnie Lee Williams walked the streets of Greenville free. 3 years during which a 13-year-old girl still had her mother, and then she did not. The gap between those two murders is the entire argument for cold case units. It is the entire argument for funding forensic DNA labs. It is the entire argument for never closing a file, never forgetting a name, never stopping. Because sometimes, the killer does not stop either. Chelsie Moss's family has waited 40 years to hear the name of the man who took her from them. 40 years of not knowing. 40 years of wondering if anyone still cared. The Greenville County Sheriff's Office did not forget. The cold case unit did not move on. And on June 16, 2026, Chelsie's family finally received an answer. We do not have their words. We do not need them. The weight of 40 years of silence finally broken, that is not something words capture. But there is one thing that matters now. Ronnie Lee Williams will face a bond hearing. He will face a judge. And Chelsie Yvonne Moss, 18 years old, found in the woods near Fair Street in 1986, will have her day in court, even if it took 40 years to get there. Cases like this remind us how many families continue living without answers long after headlines disappear. Chelsie Moss is the 16th cold case homicide solved by the Greenville County Cold Case Unit. 16 families who finally know. 16 cases that were never forgotten. But there are more. There are always more. The technology capable of solving these cases exists now. The question is whether the resources, the funding, and the will exist to use it. These are conversations that happen after the fact, after the loss, after the conviction, after it is too late. But sometimes, 40 years later, it is not too late after all. What do you think happens to a person who carries a secret like that for 40 years? Watching from a prison cell as the world forgets. And then one day, the knock comes. Not for something new, for something old. Something he thought was buried. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Case Classified for more true crime stories, unsolved mysteries, and real-life horror cases. Turn on notifications. More cases are breaking. More cold cases are being solved. And we will be here to tell those stories.